Again, we're in the book of Acts, chapter 18. I know I appreciate when Bing is teaching through John. I think it's always valuable to remember the Gospels and to be in the Gospel as even a part of your regular Bible reading. If you didn't know, if you want more of those lessons and studies, Bing does have a Sunday school at 9 a.m. here at the church, and he's going verse by verse through the book of John. It's a tremendous study. You'll be blessed by it. We all need to know more of who Jesus is. So I'd encourage you, if you want more of that, to come at the 9 a.m. hour and enjoy that time of study. Now, we are in Acts 18, and it's been a little bit, so just to remind us of where we've been and where we're at. Paul has just given a defense of his faith and the faith that we all possess there at Athens, in a place called Mars Hill, where many of the philosophers of the day would go and give their latest worldviews and philosophies to each other. And Paul was heard, but not necessarily responded to there. And so he has now entered into the cosmopolitan city of Corinth. Now remember, in general, this part of Acts is significant because the gospel is coming upon the shores of Europe. And this is the thick of some of the most historic, culturally important regions of the former Greek Empire, now at the time of Paul, the Roman Empire. So even though it's Roman-controlled territory, yet so much of that area had been shaped by the Greeks for hundreds and hundreds of years, and frankly, much of Western civilization, of which we're a part, was shaped by the things that happened in the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, and now the gospel. The gospel is coming upon these shores to challenge and transform the hearts of Europe. Now, regarding Corinth, I thought this quote I found from a commentator probably summed it up better than I could, but this is just to give a snapshot of Corinth. According to Herschel Ford, he wrote, "Corinth was a wonderful commercial center, and it was also the sports center of the ancient world. Boxing, foot races, discus throwing, and many other games were indulged in by hundreds of people and watched by thousands of others. Of course, all forms of gambling flourished. Venus, the goddess of love, was worshipped by the Corinthians. In her name, they engaged in the vilest religious rites. Sodom and Gomorrah, at their worst, were no worse than Corinth. Sailors coming from the west brought to Corinth the vilest Roman customs. Travelers from the east brought the vilest Oriental customs. The Roman Empire was rotten, yet all Rome looked down upon Corinth as a place of the greatest evil." Another commentator said, "So corrupt was Corinth that it was actually made into a verb, so that to be Corinthianized meant to be morally corrupt in the extreme." Corinth was an even more wicked city than larger cities of the empire went at this period. The very term Corinthian came to mean profligate or to practice whoredom, unquote. And so I read that description and thought, that's just Los Angeles or any any major city. It doesn't sound all that different from a description of almost any modern city today. A sports center, lots of gambling, lots of lots of prostitution and pornography and things like that. Oh, well, I think this is actually helpful. Especially since, we're hosting the World Cup, and, Los Angeles, I think, is hosting the Olympics in a couple of years. It just seems very parallel. And you might think, well, oh, man, Corinth is just like L.A. or again, any modern city. But maybe it's better to say that human nature really doesn't change. Not that, oh, wow, there's so many parallels from back then to now. Well, human nature has not changed, I would argue, significantly from the time of Genesis 3, when Adam and Eve fell in the garden. I think it's funny whenever people talk about pulling people from the past to the present day, and you think, oh, they'd be amazed by all of our technology and so on. But I honestly think the initial shock would wear off pretty quickly. because I don't understand a lot of the technology that's going on, like in my house. So much of it is now beyond my comprehension. I think they would get past that, and I think if you pulled someone from almost any point of human history into now, they would see beyond that initial shock and of technological wonders, and I think they would see very little difference in terms of the human condition and the human soul. All that to say, the Bible's very relevant to today. All that is to say that whenever we read, even going back into the time of Israel and Judah, or the time of Abraham, you're dealing with human nature. You're dealing with human fallenness, and that's always relevant to humanity. I don't think it's hard to step into the world of Corinth at the time of Paul, and if we were to, ourselves be transported back into Corinth beyond the initial shock of seeing architectural structures like the Parthenon and things like that as they stood and not as ruins, this is what it looked like before it was destroyed, you would find human nature is human nature. People are people. So rather than maybe judge Corinth or say, we're just like Corinth, the real point is human hearts don't really change very much. Now, in the call to worship this morning in 1 Corinthians 2, if you remember in chapter 2, verse 3, Paul had this interesting note. And of course, the books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, or the letters of 1st and 2nd Corinthians written by Paul, is to the church that is going to be established there. And he speaks of his entrance among them in 1 Corinthians 2:3. He says, "And I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling." What makes him say that? Well, why does he refer to himself in such humbling terms? Well, remember, at this point, Paul is alone. Timothy, Silas, Luke, they're in Macedonia, ministering still. But prior to that, though, he was persecuted and beaten publicly. He was falsely imprisoned. He hasn't necessarily had a super great time ministering the gospel to the shores of Europe. But those persecutions are not what make him proclaim his weaknesses in 1 Corinthians 2. He's not saying it to throw a pity party, in other words. When he says that, his point is, and you know what? It's just not about the messenger. In other words, if Paul's weak and trembling and in fear, and yet there was power and persistence and persuasion in his gospel, it must be God and not man that is doing the work. All those humiliations made it even more clear that his concern was the mission and not himself as the missionary. And whatever happened that would make the gospel look glorious, even if it was his weakness, his trembling, his fear, then Paul was all for it. In other words, he's saying that to them not because he's trying to elicit their sympathy or their pity. He's trying to say, look, I was not at my best when I came to you. I was discouraged. I was weak. I was alone. But the gospel still came to you, didn't it? So was that about me at all? No. And then must be the power of God, and that's the whole point in 1 Corinthians 1 and 2. It is the power of God to salvation, the gospel, not the man. Now, having said that, it's not as if God did not care about the messenger. God provided for Paul all that Paul needed. And here, there's three things I saw in the first four verses. We're only going to get through the first four verses. Three things that God provided for Paul: companionship, a career, and a calling. That's all he needed, and Paul was happy. Companionship, a career, and a calling. And I think, if you have those three things, you ought to consider yourself very blessed, very content, able to go and do all that God has commanded you. First thing that is mentioned here then in verse 2, after he leaves Athens and goes to Corinth, is, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy, with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. Now, upon entering Corinth, the Lord provided, in his kindness, in his mercy, in his meeting of Paul's needs, two companions and co-laborers in the ministry, Aquila and Prisca. Aquila means eagle, Prisca means venerable or ancient. That's the origin of the names there. What is being referred to here, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome, this is the edict of Claudius, the emperor. So I think it's funny that he just calls him by his first name here, or his well-known name, doesn't append a title or anything. But you would know this if you're reading this at the time, but we need a little bit of historical background. We've mentioned before, actually, Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, which was his full name. So Claudius, much easier to say. But he was the emperor from 41 to 54 AD. He's a decent emperor, but at the time there was a lot of famines. And so he was dealing with a lot. And a Roman historian named Suetonius wrote, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he, the emperor, expelled them from Rome. So this is a real historical thing that happened in, again, 49 AD. And it sounds like, and this is what a lot of historians and theologians argue, when it says at the instigation of Chrestus, that's actually a reference to Christians, that this was actually a disturbance between Jewish Christians and Jews. And as we've already seen, the Jewish people did not like the Jewish Christians and would persecute them. And this caused conflicts in Rome, and it got so bad, the Jewish persecution of Jewish Christians was getting so hostile and caused so much commotion that the emperor just expelled all of the Christians from Rome. So that's one interpretation. I think it's probably a likely one given what was happening at the time. But again, this is a real historical event, the Edict of Claudius in 49 AD. And so because of this couple moved from their home into Corinth, there on the Macedonian kind of, sort of peninsula. Now, Aquila is a Jewish man. He's originally from Pontus. He's what's considered a diaspora Jew. It's a Jew who does not live in Judea, who doesn't live in the promised land. If you remember, back when Paul was in what was called Asia, just before coming to Macedonia, this Asia, again, don't think of Koreans Asia, but they called Asia everything from what's now Turkey east and somewhat south. This is northern Turkey now, Pontus and Bithynia. Now, if you remember back in Acts 16, Paul wanted to go to Pontus and Bithynia to preach the gospel, but the Holy Spirit said no, directed him actually to Macedonia and to the shores of Europe. So it's interesting that now we meet a man from there, and it sounds like it doesn't give a conversion story, but the presumption is that they were already believers. Otherwise you would expect to see some kind of instance of how he met or shared the gospel with them. But it could be the case, or it's likely the case, that there are already believers there. So maybe there was already a strong presence of Christians in Pontus and Bithynia. But for whatever reason, Paul has encountered this gentleman. Now, in order to have married Priscilla, who was almost certainly Roman herself, Aquila either came from a family that had attained Roman citizenship, or he had himself somehow become a freedman on his own. And so, again, for a Jewish person or a non-Roman citizen to marry a Roman citizen, they need to become a Roman citizen. So there's a few paths to that, and somehow he had attained to that. They had apparently met somehow as tent makers. There was certainly a lot of trade in Pontus and Bithynia. There's a big coast there. Rome, of course, is the center of the empire. And so they somehow met. They made their home in Italy. But when the Jews were kicked out of Rome, this woman, Priscilla, faithfully followed her Jewish husband. Now, almost certainly, there's probably a very interesting story about how these two met and fell in love. Acts is not necessarily going to write about that, but one of the things I want to do when I get to heaven is talk to them and how did you guys meet? Because this is a very interesting situation where you got a Jew from way over here and a Roman woman from way over here. How did you guys get together? So Those sorts of things, I don't know. It's some commentators do get pretty imaginative with the love story, the backstory behind it. But something there. There's a love story there, I think, but we'll have to get more details when we get to heaven. Now, Priscilla's actually informal name, meaning her formal name is Prisca. But when you add I-L-L-A in Latin, it makes it diminutive or informal. So in Spanish, when you add ito, I-T-O, to the end of something, it means smaller, like perro is dog and perrito is puppy. So it's kind of like that. Like adding I-L-L-A makes it informal, or your friends call you that. So Priscilla is kind of an informal name. Prisca's the formal name. So you'll see Prisca in some places, but here it's Priscilla, and this is almost certainly because of Paul's close friendship with this couple. Prisca, or Priscilla, is possibly, or Prisca is a name that's associated with an aristocratic family in Italy. Not sure if she's actually related or associated with that, but we do know, again, that she's almost certainly a Roman herself. Now, in almost every other verse where the pair is mentioned, except this passage and in the greetings at the end of 1 Corinthians, Priscilla's name comes first. So in Acts 18:18, Acts 18:26, which we'll get to, Romans 16:3, 1 Corinthians, 2 Timothy 4:19, it's Prisca and Aquila, or Prisca and Aquila. Now, commentators try to explain this all different kinds of ways. They suggest that maybe Prisca was higher in social rank, or more prominent in the church, or maybe just more talkative and assertive between the two. But we'll get back to that later because we're going to come across it later in the chapter. But whatever we might want to say, they're both of them served together in the gospel. Both of them knew their Bible very well. Both of them were very active, involved in the church. And needless to say, Paul, who had been traveling alone since leaving Timothy and Silas and Luke, he would have welcomed meeting this couple. The word found there, he found a Jew named Aquila. Sometimes found means you're looking for it and you found it, but sometimes it's more like discovered, right? It came upon you, and I think here that's more the sense that God brought about this providential or divine appointment as Paul sought to make some money or get involved in the community through tent making. Again, they were tent makers by trade, and so that's likely the connection that brought about this community. And I think this is helpful. Again, God was very kind to Paul after going to Athens and being provoked in his spirit by all this idolatry there, giving a defense for the gospel and having very mixed results or very tepid response. He'd just come off of course, being persecuted and beaten and profoundly mistreated. I think this was a great encouragement to meet this couple. I can think of so many times divine appointments where the Lord just brings someone into your life or couple into your life at the right time to minister to you, to speak to you, to come alongside you. Those moments have been all throughout my life. I hope you have the same testimony. I think it's helpful to think like this. This changed Paul's direction in ministry in the sense that he ends up bringing Priscilla and Aquila with him along his missionary journey, and they're going to be planted in Ephesus there. So it can be a significant part of the church in Ephesus. Now, this was not a planned thing by Paul. This was just, he found them. It was something that happened to him. You just don't know when that will happen to you, right? The Lord just brings people into your life. It just changes the course of everything. But I want to encourage you that you might be that for someone else, that you might be the one to step in at a profound moment in someone else's life if you're willing to open your eyes to see the divine appointments God is presenting to change the course of someone else's life just by your kindness, just by your willingness to encourage or walk alongside someone. This kind of companionship should be what we see on Sundays and in our fellowship together. You don't know what people have gone through this past week. And assume that the Lord has brought us together today so that you might know and encourage and come alongside in this kind of profound way. I very much think that this was something Paul desperately needed, or else God would not have done it. So in God's provision, he gave to Paul in Corinth this companionship, this friendship with this couple. We'll say more about them as it again comes up later. Speaking of tent making, the second thing that Paul provided to Corinth there, to Paul in Corinth, was a career. Verse 3 says, and he went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. Now, tent making is a very labor-intensive job. Tents were made of leather. So what you're really talking about is leather working, which requires a lot of handwork, pushing and pulling awls, A-W-L-S, out of leather to make holes and then tying them together with straps. It's kind of tedious, it's not something that you would expect a man like Paul to be pursuing as far as a career. Because if you remember, he was training to be something more akin to a lawyer than a tent maker or a carpenter or something on the manual labor side of things. He was being raised up, being taught by Pharisees. He was zealous, again, persecuting Christians. His realm was more political, likely, or more religious than manual labor. But I can understand here the desire when he could kind of pick something to do in terms of a trade that might help him as he tried to plant churches, something like tent making. During COVID, I picked up a lot of random hobbies, and almost all of them were kind of manual labor kinds of things. There's something about creating something with your hands, something very tactile and physical, especially when so much of the gospel work that Paul was doing was talking and praying and persuading and being beaten and being persecuted. There must have been something nice, I think, about such a manual job. And tent making, of course, was something that was very necessary in that culture too, so it doesn't hurt that it's something that's in demand. Roman military is everywhere. They need tents. These merchants, they oftentimes were traveling merchants, so they needed tents. They didn't have RVs and motels every few miles, so you carried that stuff on your back. If you didn't have a lot of money, then you carried your house. You carried, when you traveled, you carried it on your back, and you set up your tent. So you'd probably want to take something to make shelter. It was a good business, a safe business to be in. And yes, it did provide a means for Paul to make money. Now, we're in the early stages of the church. You don't have missionary agencies yet. Paul wasn't a pastor staying in one church. Paul had made clear, actually, to Timothy that the expectation for the flock is to support their elders. 1 Timothy 5:17 and 18. The whole letter is really about instructions for the church and for the elders. And Paul says pretty clearly, he says, "Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, 'You shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain, and the laborer deserves his wages.'" And so that's just a way of saying you should be supporting, churches should support the pastors and elders who are at their church. They're worthy of that honor, and that honor there, it does mean, support, monetary support. But Paul wasn't exactly that. He's a church planter. He's going around from region to region, hardly knows where he's going to sleep next. And so it was prudent for him to have some kind of trade that he could ply and make a living if he needed to. Now, sometimes we see this idea that Paul was a tent maker and wonder if this is promoting, say, being a bivocational pastor. Bivocational meaning a pastor who is working often one other job besides the pastoring job? Well, aside from 1 Timothy 5:17 and 18, which I just mentioned, which seems to picture the congregation, if they can, supporting their pastors, I don't think that Paul's situation here is necessarily the same as saying that pastors should be bivocational. But I do want to point out a few things about Paul's career here as a tent maker, because I think it's fascinating that this former Pharisee, zealous man for the Lord, wrote so much of the New Testament, someone we tend to put on a little bit of a pedestal and honor. He had a affinity for, at least he would often be working, just, working leather and making tents, which is somewhat of a mundane kind of job. So I want to make a few comments about that because, this is God providing for Paul this career. First comment I want to make is that it actually did not cover his expenses. In 2 Corinthians 11, he kind of makes clear to the Corinthians, again, this is a letter to the same church there. In 2 Corinthians 11, 7 through 9, he says, "Or did I commit a sin in humbling myself so that you might be exalted because I preached God's gospel to you free of charge? I robbed other churches." Now, he's being a little bit sarcastic. He didn't steal from them, but he means he took support from them. "I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. And when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my needs, so I refrained and will refrain from burdening you in any way." And this is a reference when Timothy and Silas came finally from Macedonia to meet up with Paul. They likely had some support that they had gathered from the Macedonian churches and brought it to Paul. Now, Corinth was actually a pretty rich city, so it's not like they couldn't afford it, but Paul wanted to make so clear that, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but Paul wanted to make clear that it wasn't about the money. So that's actually the second point. The first point is he didn't actually make enough to make ends meet this way. So the point wasn't that he was trying to pursue some separate career or that this was actually a workable, necessary situation, if this was some kind of argument for pastors being bivocational. The second comment is that by not asking support from the people that he was ministering to, he was demonstrating that his motives were pure and only for the sake of the gospel, not anything he could gain from them. And this, of course, makes sense as a church planter, that coming into a new region, if the first thing you did was start to ask people for money, it starts to sound kind of funny, right? You come into a new place. "I'm here to plant a church. I need your money to do it, though." Well, that can taint the motive, certainly. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, I won't read all of verses 1 through 18, but that whole section is really about Paul defending the fact that he could have asked for compensation because he is an apostle of God. He has a right to so many things. He could, in fact, impose some kind of fee to support his work there. But he says, "I intentionally did not. I did not make use of this right." He says in verse 12, "But we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ." Verse 15, "But I have made no use of any such rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision, for I'd rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have reward. But if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with stewardship. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel." Now, it's not that it was free. Again, Paul had to work, and also the Macedonian churches met his supply. What he means is free to you, Corinthians, that I can come to you and not have to charge you, quote unquote, for the gospel, or have you accuse me in any way of doing this for the money. Now, it's almost ironic because by the time you get to 2 Corinthians, there was these so-called super apostles. Really, they were false teachers who had worked their way into the Corinthian church, and they were so impressive that they were willingly giving their money to these false teachers, and these false teachers, like today's prosperity gospel preachers, would ask for money. And they started to get suspicious of Paul, like, wait a second, why aren't you asking for money? Aren't you worth it? It's such a funny kind of backward idea, and if you read 2 Corinthians, he gets into just, you got it all upside down. you got it backward here. They're fleecing you. I'm doing it out of love. But you see it as a sign of weakness that I don't ask for money. The Corinthians were messed up. We'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. But second point regarding Paul's career here is part of that was just to not taint the gospel with any other motives there. And actually, to be honest, there's oftentimes I think if people think I do this for the money, I don't control my salary here. That's totally up to you guys. If there's a way for me to prove I don't do this for the money, I would. And if you ask me to do this for free, frankly, I would. I'm here for you. You tell me what you want me to do. I genuinely mean that. Because there are times where I think that that people will say, oh, those pastors, they're in it for the praise and the glory and the money. I'm still waiting on the praise and the glory part. No, you guys are very encouraging. You guys are, I don't need it, but you guys are very encouraging and supportive, and I know your prayers. I know it more and more as I've gotten longer in this ministry that I am not here aside from your prayers and support. I used to think it's because of me, or to a certain degree like God, but even then it's like because of me and God. But I realize more and more as I get in this ministry, it's your relationship with God and your prayers that God is listening to about this, and not necessarily my own. But in any case, I can sympathize with. There's many times I just think, I don't know. I hope no one thinks that I'm doing this for the money. Third comment I want to make on Paul's career as a tent maker is that really he wasn't bivocational either. He actively conducted ministry while he worked. So you think about it, as a tent maker, you'd have maybe a booth in the marketplace. It's a way both to advertise your work and show your work and meet your customers and interact with people. And so you can imagine Paul sitting with Priscilla and Aquila at whatever booth they'd set up at the marketplace, and they're making these tents together. And maybe it's not clear in a sense here, but I think the idea is definitely that while they made tents, they talked. And what did they talk about? The latest sports and gambling stuff that's happening in Corinth? No, they talked about Scripture. They talked about the things of God. It was discipleship. Hours and hours doing maybe on the one hand relatively mundane labor, but on the other hand he was ministering to them. I think almost certainly this is what Paul is talking about in 1 Thessalonians as well. 1 Thessalonians 2, Paul says that he labored night and day with the Thessalonians, and I think this means that he was making tents there as well. 1 Thessalonians 2:9, he says, "For you remember, brothers, our labor and toil, we work night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you, while we proclaim to you the gospel of God." So how can you say, well, Paul, like you worked as a tent maker night and day. When did you have time to minister? He says, at the same time we were doing that, we were proclaiming to you. While we proclaimed to you the gospel of God. So for Paul, this tent making thing also happened to be ministry as well. So not exactly like bivocational pastor situation here, where oftentimes what that means is a pastor's working a pastor job and like has a totally secular other job. No, I think a lot of teaching, a lot of sharing was happening, while he was working alongside the Thessalonians. While he was toiling and laboring, he still got a lot done. So it's not exactly like a bivocational situation. And I understand that as well. Sometimes I invite people to just go on an errand with me, if it's a church-related errand, so that even on the car ride, we can talk and share. And share in discipleship and encourage each other. Sometimes to pray. There's many times to just go on an errand, sit and then come back and sit in the parking lot for another 30 minutes or more and just keep talking ministry and discipleship. There's ministry in those kinds of moments, even in running an errand, going down to the store. So I think Paul, doing this career, he picked something that he could do kind of, mindlessly is not the right word, because I don't think he was careless or not diligent as a tent maker. I think he put, he did it unto the Lord as best as he could, but it's a relatively straightforward kind of thing, and it's purposeful, so that while you're doing it, you can talk, and you can think and pray and converse, and of course customers are coming by too, so. Paul, like me, probably a talker, and someone comes asking about tents, and you start talking about, did you know that Jesus tabernacled, he tented with us, and start talking about Jesus, of course. Last comment to make about Paul's career here is I do think he's setting an example, though, for all believers. Not all of us are church planters or pastors, but all believers should work hard. There's a dignity to our labors. By Paul choosing to also work when he could have, again, asked the Corinthians to support him. He could have begged around more from other churches to support him, but he chose to do this. I think the last comment just being that this was to demonstrate there is dignity and God's glory and honor in work, which most of you have jobs. I certainly had other jobs before I took this job. I was in the Army, worked at Disneyland, worked at Hollywood Video, worked at a customs brokerage, worked at doing an after-school program. Many jobs before I was pastoring, and there's dignity and glory in all those things. I don't think this is more holier than that. God was honored in all of those different roles I had, in all those jobs. Look at 2 Thessalonians 3:8. 2 Thessalonians 3:8, Paul writes, starting verse 7, "For you yourselves know how you ought to imitate us." Setting an example, because we were not idle when we were with you, nor did we eat anyone's bread without paying for it, but with toil and labor we worked night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you. It was not because we do not have that right, but to give you in ourselves an example to imitate. For even when we were with you, we would give you this command: if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. So there he kind of goes extra hard on it. Of course, there's dignity and glory in working. He sets the example. But also, if you happen to like eating, you should work. Now, of course, not everyone has the capacity to work. If there's extenuating circumstances, he's not talking about those kind of situations. But normally, able-bodied person who likes to live and eat should have a job. That's just typical. And there's glory and dignity in that. So, just a couple comments on Paul's career that God graciously provided to him in Corinth. Of course, an example to us as well, to you as well, for if you are finding yourself in a job or career that's not as luxurious as ministry. I'm saying that a little tongue-in-cheek. God is just as honored and glorified by your hard work and toil there as he is in any hardworking pastor. That's not most people. Well, I don't know if there's going to be pastors in heaven, now that I think about it. So, but I do think there's going to be work in heaven. Just maybe not pastors, because we'll have God to teach us. So your job might be more secure than mine. Okay, last, from a heavenly perspective. Okay, last thing, and this is the shortest point. So we have God providing for Paul companionship in Corinth, and God providing a career in Corinth, but also God providing a calling in Corinth. Now, this is the shortest point. He says, and he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. It's not the least significant, but it's the shortest point in the sermon and almost in here because we've already seen the pattern already. We don't need to belabor the point. As was Paul's custom, he went to the synagogues on the Sabbath and he reasoned with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, trying to persuade them. These are both in the imperfect tense, meaning he continually, habitually did this in the past, where he reasoned with them and persuaded them. But notice, what is he reasoning for? And what is he trying to persuade them of? It's missing. It just says he's trying to reason with them and persuade them. Why is it missing? It's because you already know. By this point in Acts 18, if you've been with us, or if you've ever read the book of Acts, you know Paul's MO. He is about the gospel. His passion, his calling is to preach Christ from the scriptures. His calling actually had not changed. So when I say that God provided a call in Corinth, it's not something different. It's only to say that no matter where Paul was, no matter what condition or situation he found himself in, his calling was the same. As a follower of Christ, it was to preach Christ. And each of you have the same calling if you're a Christian. Maybe you can do that while you work. Maybe you can't. I understand. But you must be a Christian wherever you are. You're called to that, no matter where you are. Maybe you have many companions or just two. But I hope you're encouraged that you're not alone. Maybe you're between jobs. Well, the Lord will provide so that you can fulfill your calling. Not to be a tent maker, per se, or accountant, or whatever it is. He's providing the job so that you might fulfill your calling, so that by those means you can support the preaching of the gospel. Whether that's supporting ministries and missions, whether that's just supporting yourself so that you can go and share the gospel with your family and friends. God is providing. He's provided all of us with companions and career and calling, or at least that is his desire and design for us. And if you have those things, I think you ought to consider yourself very blessed today. That if you feel that you don't know you don't know what you're doing and you don't know how to do it and you don't know where you are, think about these three things. Who are your friends? Who are close to you? Who can come alongside you to encourage you in what God is calling you to do? Consider that God has provided for you a job. Or if you're between jobs, that God's desire is for you to find a way to support yourself and the ministry of the gospel, either directly as you go forth or indirectly through missions and ministries and churches. And again, consider your calling. If you are a Christian this morning, you're not just biding your time until you die or Jesus comes back, but that your calling is to be a Christian, to go and share the good news that Jesus Christ lived, died, rose again for the forgiveness of sins, and to restore us to a right relationship with him, not through works, by grace through faith, and that is available to all. That is your calling, no matter where you are, who you are. If you're not a Christian this morning, I hope you see in this historical account the same kind of ministry and gospel today as existed 2,000 years. I think there's a lot to say about that kind of argument that Christianity is claiming today to be just as valuable, insightful, necessary 2,000 years ago in Corinth as it is today in Irvine, California, 2026. That the human nature we see in all of the all the immorality of Corinth is not any different, at least in terms of heart, souls, than the kind of immorality we see around us today. And the solution is the same, a new heart that is found only when we repent and confess that Jesus is Lord, the one who rules our hearts. And so if you're not a Christian this morning, I urge you, come to him by grace through faith, not any of your works, not because of who your mom or dad is, not held back because of any rotten thing you've ever done. God, who is God and knows everything, knows all that you've done. He still loves you. His son still died for sinners such as me. Come to him, and he will accept you. Let go of the sins and he will forgive in Christ.